early on in one of my early meetings with the Chancellor, even before he was onboarded in July, Daniel's expressed an interest in being able to come and spend time with the faculty and to be able to talk scholarship. And so many of the other meetings that he's in, he's of course talking about the university and return to campus and all these things that are so important to all of our lives. But here among friends, we wanted to be able to spend some time talking a little bit about some of the intellectual pursuits that the Chancellor's had over the years and help you get to know him a little bit better. And of course, I don't need to do a lot of introduction because so many of you have gotten to know Daniel well on his onboarding process into the school and into the university. Certainly as a tenured faculty member at Owen, we got to see a lot of Daniel's work, and that was really exciting. And as you know, his research really spans the intersection of political economy and business, but with so many ranging areas from linguistics to computer science, psychology, operations research. He truly is a Renaissance player across many different fronts. And as you know from his career, he started it at Stanford at GSB, and then on to Kellogg, and a really great run at Kellogg. I think Kelly and Daniel overlapped a little bit there during that time.
Yep.
And then on to the University of Chicago, first as the dean of the policy school, the Harris School, and then a couple years later, they tapped him on the shoulder to come and be provost, where he spent 4 years really in charge of all areas, academic and research focused across the university. But, you know, beyond the list of accomplishments and hundreds of papers and books and so forth, there's just some really wonderful things that we've all come to love about Daniel, being a first generation college graduate himself. Spending time at Rochester. We have a number of our faculty who have spent time at Rochester during their careers, and so lots of overlap there. And he and his wife have 2 sons that are both in college, so he's living the experience on both sides.
Living the dream. Living
the dream. So we're just so delighted to have you here today, Daniel.
Well, thank you, Eric. That's wonderful. So I'm excited to have this opportunity to talk to you really as fellow faculty members, and you know, it was great to join the Owen faculty. And you know, I've spent, as many of you know, Eric just mentioned, I spent most of my life as a business school faculty member. So it's kind of great to connect with you in that capacity as well.
Awesome. So that's really our goal here this afternoon, is to really focus on scholarship. It's kind of a unique hour. So certainly if you have questions along the way, toss them into the Q&A function there in Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can along the way. But we have a set of questions that Ranga and Kelly and I have already dreamed up to kind of get things rolling, and we'll each ask a question or two ourselves, and then we'll let you all jump in as we go along. But the goal really is to talk about all things business and scholarship today, not return to campus or other such things. And well, I say that, but certainly when you look at Daniel's research, so much of what he's been doing and thinking about on a scholarly front over the last couple decades are really directly related to his role at Vanderbilt now and in leading an institution in a very interesting time. I mean, I think we all recognize it's a time of outrage. Reputation is increasingly important, and it's an area that Daniel has spent a good bit of time over his career thinking about, including a book that he wrote called Reputation Rules. And, you know, one of the things I just wanted to start off with, Daniel, was just to have you talk a little bit about what you learned studying reputation, how that applies to Vanderbilt. And in particular, you talk about the need for reputation to be really closely managed and tightly integrated with business. That it can't be something just off on the side. You've got the reputation team off working on it, that it really has to be built into the business. And so what does that look like in a university?
Well, great question. So couple of comments on that. I think the first thing is that One reason why I think that thinking about corporate reputations, broadly construed now, including universities and others as well, is super important because I think we've gotten to understand more and more, during the last decades, that the sustainable competitive advantage very often rests on kind of two pillars. The first one is the ability to attract and retain and develop the best talent. So that's the people side of it. And the second part of it is the reputation side. So you can call that brand or reputation, and Kelly and I can do some arm wrestling, what's the better term. But it's basically about how we're being perceived in the marketplace by our core constituencies, whether that's customers for business or students and faculty, alumni, and so forth for a university. And if you think about, professional service organizations, a McKinsey or a law firm, but what do they have, right? They got their people and they got their reputation. They may have a bunch of laptops, but I don't think they own them anymore. And so there are no physical assets or strategic advantages other than that, the ability to attract the best people, develop them, a culture that comes with that, and the reputation. Of course, that's not true for all businesses and not all the time, but it's true for many of them, and I think increasingly so. And so that's really what triggered my interest in that, is that I felt that we had really no rigorous way of thinking about what I would consider a hugely important topic, in contrast to how we think about people. There's an entire enormous, voluminous literature on, HR and personnel management and leadership and culture. And, we have all this toolbox, but we got nothing. I would argue nothing or very little things on reputation. We have a lot on marketing, but reputation is a different concept that is, I think, is much broader. So that's what got me interested in that. Practically speaking, it really started after the crisis that didn't happen, which was, we all forgot that now, Y2K. And that's how I got interested in that. And, our company's ready to deal with that. And then I started working with that at Kellogg at the time. And then 9/11 hit and the collapse of Arthur Andersen. And that really kind of created, I think, more and more interest in these types of issues. And that kind of, we started then developing curriculum material, and that more and more morphed into a research agenda. So for those of you that are still looking for like great holiday gifts, so my new book's coming out soon, which is, title's not clear yet, but it's on kind of an analytical approach to like reputation. Is coming out at University of Chicago Press probably in a couple of months, but not quite sure yet. I may miss the holiday season, we'll see. But what I've been trying to do is really to use social sciences broadly construed to understand, in detail about what shapes reputation. And there are many different dimensions to this. The psychological dimension is hugely important, but there's also insights from game theory, particularly when you deal with like social activists. There's, you mentioned that there are text analytical methods, there's statistical methods that I'd like to introduce in this area, but let me focus on the psychology part. When you think about something like the university, and I'm just gonna use the COVID-19 pandemic as an example. Our reputation is hugely important. It's a hugely important aspect on, as we're thinking about, what is the value of universities, right? It's the people and it's the reputation part. We got some buildings and stuff like that, but that's not worth a lot without those two pieces. So what you wanna think about is, what are the factors that drive that? And during a crisis like this one, I would say it's three. It's the first one is the ability to maintain trust during an environment of sustained and persistent uncertainty. And there is a literature on what drives trust. What are the components on that? The famous thing is, it's basically, you need to be capable of what you're doing, you need to have integrity, and you have to be benevolent. So it's kind of a classic way of people thinking, but there's a lot more on that, and you can directly utilize this of how you communicate, for example, during the context of a pandemic, the importance of transparency, of empathy, of commitment, of demonstrating your expertise. And all of these are well understood concepts, and you want to incorporate them in how you think about it. The second big literature that plays a role on that is the literature on risk perception. So when you have something particular like that involves safety, like a global pandemic, understanding how risk perception differs from objective risk is hugely important. And that is something where, leaders can incorporate those insights and then think about it, how they communicate. And the last thing I'm going to say, which comes from anthropology, is the distinction between exchange and community orientations. Again, people have used that in the context of, for example, corporate culture and so forth. But it's a super important concept when you think about how do you communicate during a crisis that affects an entire community. So I think there are many insights from the social sciences that are directly relevant of how we think about reputation management, the role of communications, how we make decisions, how we anticipate risk, that we are well advised to incorporate into our repertoire as leaders, as we're thinking about these types of issues.
That's great. Well, speaking of arm wrestling, I brought Kelly along to ask some more questions in this vein. So Kelly.
Yes, absolutely. So I read your first book and I'm very excited about the forthcoming one. I noted that in chapter 2 of Reputation Rules, you talk about how even then when you wrote that book, we were living in an era of reputational risks. And building on the point you just raised, I think that's maybe more true now than it's ever been before. And one thing that's interesting to me about being at Vanderbilt is we're in a situation where we have a variety of different audiences that we're managing our reputation in front of. So, we have our students, obviously, but there's also alumni and donors, there's faculty, there's other academics, and there's even the broader global audience. So given that COVID has shifted so many eyes towards examining what well-managed universities are doing right now, what are some good strategies for managing our own risks with those different audiences?
It's a great point, and I think I would argue that this is arguably the biggest difference between thinking about brands and thinking about reputation. So when we think about brands, and I know that some people that think about branding more broadly, like, or our beloved Phil Kotler, would think about branding for, that's everything. That's the world. Mm-hmm. But I think that, how we usually think about it, we think about branding as focused on customers. And, maybe you expand it broader, but you don't think about it as, the political environment or in the context of university, your alums or your faculty or anything like that. That's where the reputation is more important. So the key thing I think to keep in mind here, which is to understand that each one of these constituencies has very different concerns and questions in mind. So faculty may be concerned about issues of academic freedom. That's one thing, right? Or they may be concerned about their personal safety during a COVID-19. Parents may be particularly interested in the safety for their students. That's another dimension. Staff may be interested, also in their own safety. Parents may also be interested, in issues, for example, of like, what are these 4 years look like? Are we really getting a great education? And then students have all sorts of concerns and all sorts of instincts that they have in their mind. And, and so you have this multiplicity of perspectives. Sometimes there's a real tension. So I would say that, for example, if you have you have to make a decision where there's a tension between, let's say, environmental activists and your investors, or your own people and your investors. For example, you may want to engage in a particular climate change policy, or you may want to take a stance on issues such as gun control or immigration, where there's a split among your constituencies. These can be very tough and difficult. In the COVID-19, I actually don't think it's that hard. And the reason for that is that once you go back, and this is an advantage when you're a mission-driven organization, you ask yourself, what are we doing? What's the purpose? And what our purpose is to have transformative education and path-breaking research that have a real impact. That's what we are. And almost everyone, from what I've listed, so I would argue everyone, is connected to that purpose in one way or another. So the important part of that, I think, then is to bring back the decisions that you're making to your purpose. So what does that mean? That meant, for example, for us is to say, well, what's our purpose? Our purpose is to get our faculty back into the libraries, offices, and the labs so that they can do what they want to do and what we want to do at a research institution. And secondly, we are committed as a residential education. Our commitment is to residential education. That's who we are. We believe in that, whether that's at the professional level or at the undergraduate level. So that meant doing everything possible in order to enable that particular modality of teaching in an environment of the pandemic. So that's different than focusing exclusively only on the safety and health aspects. Because if you were to focus on those aspects, say you may make different decisions. So I think you have to ask yourself in those contexts always, whenever you have multiple constituencies, what are my values, what's my purpose, and then try to connect the different concerns and perspectives back on that core purpose. So we worked very hard at that. I think successfully so, but the tension, the fundamental tension, Kelly, that you point to is exactly correct. It is that in a reputational context, you have multiple constituencies, each one of them may be pulling in a different direction. I just don't think that this is a necessity or can't be overcome in the context of the current pandemic if you're able to connect it back to your purpose and your core values.
Well, that is certainly great to hear. I'm glad one thing in 2020 is going to go a little easier for us. So another thing I liked about your book, you also talk about the expert trap. And I had a kind of a personal question there, which as an expert yourself in this area, have you ever felt yourself kind of pulled into this expert trap personally?
Yes. So what's the expert trap? The expert trap really goes back to foundational work that goes back to Simon and Newell's work on expertise. And the key insight that Simon and Newell had was that expertise is fundamentally about pattern recognition. Is that you learn how to recognize patterns. There's a beautiful experiment that they've done with chess grandmasters. You know that they are, when they kind of play these like 40 different games at the same time, and then they go from one to the other and they win like 38 out of 40. You think like, oh my God, how can you remember all these games? Well, they don't remember the games, but what they do is they look at the board and they can read the board immediately and then make the right move. That's pattern recognition. And the reason why we know that that's the case is because of the following experiment. So people would give grandmasters a chessboard, take away the parts, the pieces, and then ask them to reconstruct it from memory. And a chess grandmaster can do this much, much better than an average person, but only if the position comes from a real game. If it's randomly set up, they're not better than the layperson. So because it doesn't make sense to them, it's not a pattern that is meaningful, because it doesn't come from a real game. So there was a beautiful experiment that suggests that expertise about pattern recognition. But what does that mean? That means that when you as an expert look at the world, you look at the world in a very peculiar way. You've trained many, many hours to be able to see it in that way, but that's not the way the rest of the world sees it. Okay, and I used to teach this to my students. This is that's probably an old story. Nobody remembers it, but there was a long time ago. There was a little kid that was whose family had fled from Cuba. Elian Gonzalez, and everybody.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that story? Everybody drowned. A horrible story, and he was in his uncle's house, and then immigration came in and took him out. And there's a famous picture where one of the immigration agents points a gun, and you see that frightened girl, the frightened boy with his uncle in a closet. Famous picture. And I used to do work for the FBI, and you work with the FBI, and I always would show them that picture, and then I tell them, what do you see? And what the people that were from law enforcement saw, that officer did exactly the right thing. Pointed the gun away from the boy, stretched out finger, not engaged at the trigger, because they were looking at how this person was executing his particular skill, which is to, be a member of a SWAT team. You and I look at that and we focus on the terrified boy. And we think, oh my God, that's horrible. So the difficulty is, when you're an expert, is to set aside your expertise and see it from the point of view where you're not an expert. That's super hard. So where this happened to me, for example, is when you're provost, of course, you're dealing with very intricate issues having to do with, faculty governance or Title IX regulations or anything like that. So you very quickly conceptualize this along those lines, and that's how you communicate it. But a parent or the general public has no idea what you're talking about. So a classic example is you talk about, we can't talk about this because of FERPA regulation. And people look at you and they're thinking, what are you talking about? Well, there's this privacy thing and that and this, and we can't do that. That doesn't work. So the danger is like because you're an expert, you're seeing the world naturally in a different way than a non-expert, but then you're communicating in a way that makes sense to you and intuitively, but makes no sense at all for the general public.
Mm-hmm.
So the heuristic that I use in this case, and I ask myself, how would I explain this to my grandma? Or who would you explain this to a 15-year-old? Something like in a way that you set aside those aspects and discipline yourself to think about it from a layperson's point of view, because that's the typical environment that you're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, since we have another second left, I want to ask you, for the experts on our faculty, I'm thinking during these strange kind of unprecedented COVID times, we might be experiencing a bit of an empathy gap with our students. Is there anything really tactical we can take away from this understanding of the expert trap that might help us kind of commiserate or empathize a little bit better with our students?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that the lack of empathy is maybe the most important piece of that. So what I would recommend, it's very easy for us to focus on what we're good at in these skill sets. And what we're good at, of course, is we're experts. That's what we do. We got our PhD, we got our advanced degrees. We've been doing this for years. This is our comfort zone. We know a lot more than everybody else on that. So to do that, I think the way to get out of it is to discipline yourself to connect with people, not as experts, professor, and student, but as human being to human being. And when you do that, and you discipline yourself to that. So you just, you meet with a student that comes into your office hours, or, I talk to somebody and they have a question or something, and you just ask them first of all, how are you doing? How are you holding up? And it's a simple thing, but it immediately creates a human connection, and people connect with you in a very different way. And you avoid this kind of, very cold interaction, very kind of technical interaction, which is usually appropriate, but which is in the current climate, I think easily misinterpreted as being, you don't care, right? You don't connect with me as a human being.
I love that suggestion. All right, well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly.
Well, certainly CSR has been another thread through your research over the years. And so Ranga has a couple questions for you on CSR.
Great, thank you, Eric. Hi, Daniel. So I wanted to ask you about your work on corporate social responsibility. So I had a chance to start reading, I'll confess, your most recent book, which is titled Corporate Social Responsibility.
You and 30 other people. Very good, yes.
Exactly. But I like the title, Corporate Social Responsibility, Reputation and Private Politics, the Strategic Interaction Between Activists and Firms. Given you've done a lot of work in this area, can you talk about how the notion of corporate social responsibility changing or has changed? And in particular, what does it say to the expectations that organizations or firms need to take positions on controversial topics?
Yes, so, well, great question. And thank you for being a loyal customer. I love that. This is a book that I just published last fall. It's a very technical book, and it takes a different look, a different point of view on corporate social responsibility. So let me first give you that different perspective, and then I'm gonna come back to the history aspect, because these things intersect, I think, in very interesting ways. So the dominant discourse on corporate social responsibility has been on the question of, kind of Milton Friedman's argument originally. What should be the purpose of an organization? It has been normative in nature. I think there was a dominant discourse for many years, and you hope the whole debate about shareholder value and all of that. And then there's a second piece, then there was a second area, very old argument, but popularized by Michael Porter, on the sense is this kind of doing well by doing good, which is an empirical hypothesis fundamentally that's saying that if you engage in CSR activities, that will also benefit your shareholders. So I'm going to set aside the moral question for a moment. And I think, on the empirical side, there is, I think I'm maybe overstating it a little bit, but not too much. The evidence that engaging in CSR activity really benefits your bottom line is mixed at best. It depends on the business. It's like the effects are small, if anything. Then getting the causality right is complicated. So I think the literature there has been disappointing in really being able to identify this relationship. So Having said that, many companies do that and engage in that. And then you ask yourself, well, if there's no bottom line impact, why are they doing that? Is this an agency problem? Is this basically people, kind of advancing their own agenda with shareholder money, which was Milton Friedman's argument fundamentally. But there's a totally different way to think about this. And that different way is to think about CSR not as kind of differentiation or like product differentiation, but to think about it as defensive, as risk management. And that is really triggered by the emergence of modern activism. So the idea there is, it's not that you're engaging in environmental practices because you want to differentiate yourself from your competitor. There's some of that, but that's not why Pepsi is doing it. That's the argument. The reason why Pepsi is doing it, because if it didn't do so, it would be targeted by social and environmental activists, and that would have a negative impact on its reputation in a significant way. And of course, we all know stories like that from the Brent Spar, which is a famous case between Greenpeace and BP, or attacks on the oil industry, or boycotts on the Nestle boycott and the Nike boycott. That's on labor conditions. So the idea there is that what activists are trying to do is they are not punishing companies for bad behavior. They're targeting companies to force the company to change its behavior. And then when it does so, it has an impact on the entire industry. So to put it differently, if you're an activist on gay rights, for example, you go after leading companies. Once they adopt these processes in order to avoid being singled out as being homophobic, for example, that can have an impact on the entire industry. Understanding these processes in detail turns out to be super hard and complicated. And so hence I wrote together with David Besenko, another former Kellogg person, Kelly, and our former student, Mike Abito, a kind of technical book that puts this in the context of a kind of dynamic game theory framework. That's the idea. And you want to think about this as a form of, we call it private politics or private regulation. So what Greenpeace is trying to do, for example, by targeting Mattel, it wants to have an impact on Mattel and its suppliers, as if the government were to pass a law. That's the idea. So if Mattel changes its procurement policies with respect to supply chain policies, with respect to sustainable paper products, every one of their suppliers has to do that. And it is functionally equivalent to having a government pass a law. That's super impactful when you're dealing with suppliers that are sitting in developing economies where you would have very little regulation. So we've seen this on labor law and so forth. The interesting development is, Ranga, that comes back to your original question, is that the types of issues have changed over time. So in the first chapter, which was, for example, the South Africa boycott, companies doing business in South Africa, or the Nestle boycott in the 70s, which was about Nestle selling milk powder in sub-Saharan Africa with allegedly or very bad consequences for infant health, was about conduct by the company, which was legal, but which people found ethically wrong. So I'm telling you, you got to stop that, because what you're doing is ethically wrong, and I'm going to boycott your products. Chapter 1. Chapter 2, the Nike boycott. So there we're not targeting Nike, but we were this is Michael Jordan and the soccer balls and the labor conditions in South Asia. There the target was not Nike, but the suppliers. Okay? So we're basically, the critical question for the company was, the normative question for the company was, what's the scope of my responsibility? And when you look at that first, Nike and other companies would say, well, that's not me. Those are the suppliers over there. I'm not going to do that. That didn't work anymore. And so over time, companies accepted or had to accept, because of the successful pressure by global activists, that their responsibility and exposure would go beyond the legal boundaries of the company. If you remember Apple and its labor practices, labor law is great at that. I mean, labor regulations, great example. Apple and Foxconn, the Rasa Planer collapse in Bangladesh. All these are questions about supply chain. Mm-hmm. The last chapter, which is super interesting and worth thinking about, is what's happened in the last 2 to 3 years. Now companies and CEOs have been willing, and this is new. This was a fringe activity a while ago. Now it's mainstream, are willing to take positions on polarized and controversial issues. Immigration, gun control, right? Race relationships. That is something now where companies are willing to take positions that split the country in half. Famous example of that was Chick-fil-A, when Chick-fil-A basically took a position and said, we're supporting the traditional notion of the family. So what that suggests, in principle, is that you could argue is that companies are thinking about these political positions with respect to their customer base and their own people as part of a brand positioning or brand differentiation. Very interesting question, not well understood, but certainly something that we're seeing a lot of growth on over the last 2 years.
Great, that's really fascinating. And I want to bring it to Vanderbilt. So
some
of the changes that are taking place, some of the changes you're talking about, especially in the past 3 years, how relevant are they to Vanderbilt? More broadly speaking, what is our corporate social responsibility as a university?
So we're in a different position, of course, because we're a mission-driven organization. And so what that means for us is that we have to always ask ourselves, how does it connect to our core values? So that's the first question. And every organization should do that. Unfortunately, in most organizations, it doesn't carry you very far. But for university, it's a pretty broad scope. So for example, when we have issues related to diversity, inclusion, and equity, that is a core value for the university. And it's something it's directly connected to its purpose. So that's natural. Now, when things get more complicated, our issues such as, what should be your issue? What should the university's position on defunding the police? Okay, hugely important question right now. Now, my sense for that is that on policy issues that are not directly connected to the university and its core values, the university leadership should have a position of neutrality. Why? Because what are we all about? We're about research and education. Research and education needs to have a free exchange of ideas, and it's important for our faculty and our students to have really intense debate on the proper regulation and setup of policing. And I don't want to give them a party line so that they're worried that if they're publishing a paper that is not what the chancellor or the provost are thinking, that they're going to be that will have a chilling effect on the debate. So I think as university leaders, it behooves us to have issues of, I would say, principled neutrality on important policy issues where our faculty and our students will have different points of view. So the point of that is to create maximum freedom for students and faculty to have debates with each other. But on issues that are directly connected to our values, we will take very strong positions. So I personally took very strong positions on having, on the new problems for international students, having to do with, the visa requirements and online education that happened a few months ago, because that's core to who we are. And we want to be a place that attracts the best possible talent on your faculty and our students, and having what I would argue arbitrary visa restrictions or the inability of students to participate in their education after they've come to this country is undermining our ability to accomplish our mission, and then we speak up on that. So that's, I think, an important component. I say the last thing to this, I also think that we have a responsibility as universities to have a positive impact on our community. And so that, I think, is an important thing for us as members of, in this case, the national community. And so I think we want to be active and good partners to the community. And, I look forward to doing more of that. I know our faculty and our students are already doing a lot, but I think that's something for us as a university. We're the largest private employer, and of course, a tremendous impact on the local economy and on the communities where we're part of, to be conscious about that and to make sure that we have a positive impact.
Great, thank you. And I just want to ask a follow-up question. You talked about community and being responsive to the community, and we have different stakeholders who might have different goals. So which audiences should we be seeking to serve with our CSR efforts?
Well, I think let's be clear. faculty and students are free to pursue whatever they want to do on that. You know, so they may have their particular project, they may be interested in this and that and the other. I think that's great. As an entity, as a corporate entity, as an institution, we have to be much more thoughtful about that. And so the types of which where we engage or with not engage really need to be things that have where there's a broad positive impact on the community, and where we provide platforms for faculty and for students to engage. So the right way to think about this is, I think when you think about community making, it's not so much we want to do this, that, and the other, but that we want to provide platforms for our faculty and for students to engage in the type of causes that they find particularly rewarding and impactful. That's the way we think of it. Now, of course, there are going to be certain aspects where it's super important for us that we have a particular, point of view. On like, as I said before, on immigration policy, I have a point of view on things that have a direct impact on a faculty to be able to be productive, to do their work. I will have a point of view on, what happens to our students. I will have a point of view. So it's things that are specifically related to the university, where it's appropriate for the chancellor and the provost, for the institutional leaders to be very clear, very specific. But in areas where I think these are general policy areas, for example, it's better for university leaders to step back and let their faculty debate it amongst each other. That, I think, is an appropriate point of view, because that's consistent with our mission.
Great, thank you.
Well, that makes me think about one last piece. When last week we had Doug Parker here, I think I was telling you a little bit about that, and I asked him the same question, because of course, he's telling the students, really that they're in the fight for their life and working to save the airline, and the tremendous amount of uncertainty that they're facing. And I think all organizations are facing that financial uncertainty, maybe more dramatic for America than it is for Vanderbilt. But the question is, CSR sometimes viewed as a long-term strategy or a long-term investment. Why now? Should we continue investing, or can we put off some of those things for sunnier times?
It's a great question, and I think it's a really good question. It's a really good question that we need to take seriously. Just to come back to some of the themes that I mentioned briefly before, the return of investment, of investing in CSR on the bottom line of companies, the empirical evidence for that is not very strong, I would say. Okay, so if you're thinking about this as a differentiation strategy, so for example, you're saying, all right, I mentioned PepsiCo before. I want to differentiate myself from Coca-Cola because of the particular working condition that I have. The premium that I get, the evidence on that is not very strong. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence that works, but the actual evidence of that there's some. I don't want to say there's a very super interesting paper recently where they did kind of a randomized field experiment, where you saw some effect of that. But how robust that is and so forth is not clear. So these kind of product differentiation strategies in the customer space, or when you think about the reputation of your people, so you get better people, or you don't have to quite pay as much. The evidence of that is not very strong. I mean, and you see this, there's some very interesting work in sin industries, guns, gambling, pornography, all that stuff. They're able to attract plenty of talent. So it's like that is a hard case to make, I think. But that's not the only way to think about it. And I think the other way to think about it is much more compelling. So when you think, for example, what's happening in the high-tech industry right now is, Google and Facebook and all of them, right? The adjustment that they're making to their business model is in response to activist pressure of their own people that are saying, this is unacceptable, you have to take a position of that, or the broader public, or in other industry, could be their customers, could be the investors. I mean, the whole ESG environment, of course, is like a huge example of that, where people that are important constituency for your business success are saying, you have to take a position on that or else. That's different. That's a difference. Facebook is not going to be able to be more successful by taking this particular position, but it avoids the downside. So it's not a kind of brand management differentiation strategy. It's a risk management strategy, just like it would be when you change your business practices to limit your legal liability or your regulatory exposure. It's a different perspective, but I have argued, much more compelling. And of course, once you think about it that way, well, that's not optional. You just basically, it's not like you can say, well, now are not good times. If you have to respond to, a particular demand for social justice or racial justice, and you can't just say that's not the right time for me, because, you have to respond. That's just that it's like you're facing a lawsuit or you're having a regulatory response. You can't just say, "Oh, sorry, I can't talk to me next year." That doesn't work. So I think the way to think about CSR strategy is more from a risk management point of view, rather than from a product differentiation strategy, I think is much more compelling and much more fruitful, and helps us to understand not only the behavior of companies, but also helps us to understand the behavior of activists. Because one thing, for example, last point on that, activists do not go necessarily after the companies that are the worst offenders. They go after the companies where they have the biggest impact, which is super irritating for CEOs, because they feel they have done a lot already, and Starbucks get targeted all the time, even though they have a strong record on CSR. Why? Well, because they're willing to do it, and activists know that, and so they keep pushing. So this calculation, the strategic interaction between companies and activists, is complicated and complex, and we're just beginning to understand that.
That's great. Well, we have a lot of questions that have been rolling in from our faculty. And of course, we've been in areas that are of interest to many of our folks. And Craig Lewis, one of our senior finance faculty members who spent a good bit of time on the financial markets regulation side, was curious whether you expect the recent statement by the Business Roundtable to really have a material impact on corporate reputation.
Super interesting question. Okay, so of course the Business Roundtable made a statement about stakeholder society, and that to change that. Now I remember when I was a young business school faculty member, which is a while ago, my mentor at the time, David Barron at Stanford, we were teaching a class on business ethics, and he gave me a statement from the Business Roundtable, where the Business Roundtable embraced the stakeholder perspective. That's 2 decades ago. So I'm a little skeptical on what this really means. I think that what's more interesting here are these statements by BlackRock and this whole ESG movement. And I've heard a lot of that now, and I was skeptical on that before, because again, when you're getting a little on in life, you've heard the same song and dance before, with different words and with different names, but that was a powerful statement, and I think it is a stronger push in that direction than I've ever seen. So I think it's too early to tell, to see whether this really has staying power, in particular in in the current economic and financial climate. But that's more interesting to me. I think that's more interesting to me. When you really read the Business Roundtable statement carefully, it's very guarded again. But Larry Fink's letter was not guarded, and that was direct, and it created I think there was a lot of resonance on that, and this whole movement of looking at these dimensions, environmental, social, political, governance issues from an investor point of view, I think is interesting. And then, of course, you want to ask yourself about the bigger question about, what shapes the investment decisions of institutions and individuals, and what are the values that drives that institute, that aspect. That's very interesting. But at any rate, I think that's what I would pay attention to.
Certainly, the roundtable and corporations all over are really struggling to communicate and position themselves around some of the racial issues in our country. And Mark Cohen, who teaches our CSR class at Owen, was wondering about strategies for dealing with the Black Lives Movement protests that have been going on.
Very interesting and very, very challenging. I think what you had is, after the horrendous killing of George Floyd, of course, you had this, universal outrage and the subsequent instances of police brutality that we've seen. There was just, most recent one, of course, in Rochester, that for those that followed that in the last couple of days. I think what that does is it touches a human chord in all of us, and it just gives you a sense of that these are just atrocious things that are happening, and you see evidence where people are really treated in a kind of dehumanized fashion, and there's a general sense of outrage on that, and just a general it touches the humanity in all of us. So that's kind of phase one. Now, what becomes more interesting then and more challenging is the second chapter. And the second chapter, none of that is the question of, so what are we going to do about that now? And, one thing I think that is particularly difficult about the current moment, which is a little different from the civil rights era. Civil rights era was really largely about political and legal equality, desegregation of schools and the Civil Rights Act and so forth. But the issues of racial inequity now are complicated and deep and complicated and involved. So I spent, a lot of my time when I was the provost at the University of Chicago and the dean of the Harris School, of course, in Chicago at the South Side and the challenges that were there. And these are really hard problems. I mean, to have an impact on a community. I'll give you one example. So for those of you that know the layout there's Hyde Park, and then there's a beautiful park which is called Washington Park if you go further to the west. And then on the other side of the park there's a neighborhood called Washington Park. Very, very tough, very difficult neighborhood. And life expectancy from Hyde Park, you cross the park, which is half a mile, from Hyde Park to Washington Park drops by 13 years, average life expectancy. So it's just an astonishing thing. And I think what COVID-19, of course, brought to the forefront is that, African Americans and Hispanics are dying at a much higher rate than the majority of the population. And, these health inequities are in the front and center of everyone. The question is, what do you do about it? And these are complicated issues. Of course, there are historical reasons for that. That's all true. But what do you do now? And how do you invest in schools and economic opportunities and stable housing and safety issues? All these things are intertwined. And to have a real impact, on a community like that, you need to address many of these factors simultaneously. It's a tough policy problem. And I think in part, it's like there's one reason for why I think we are so interested on the symbol side right now, why this plays an important role, is in some sense because the policy problems are so hard and so difficult. And I think it's a good idea for us as we're thinking about this as academics, but also companies that are involved with that, is to ask themselves, the hard questions from a policy point of view. How do you really have positive impact, in African American communities that are distressed? And what do you do? How do you leverage the types of things that you're particularly good at? And how do you partner with others? How do you partner with civic language? That's not where the focus is right now. I think in large part because the outrage is just so high, understandably high, and because these images are so troubling and so horrific. And of course, we live in a highly polarized environment right now. But I would be very pleased if we, as leaders in this environment, are also thinking about what are the specific policy solutions that really have an impact, on these communities and their tough, difficult challenges.
Well, Kimberly Pace leads our communications curriculum at Owen. Of course, as you know, all first-year students often don't think they need communications, but need it desperately. And she works really hard with them right now. It's a busy time, but she notes that, you know, reputation focuses so much on communications, and she was wondering, you know, what are some of the key communication strategies you recommend to executives? And maybe you could even bring that back to thinking about Vanderbilt and our own communications function here.
Yeah. So I think, you know, I mean, it's an interesting dilemma, is that the more senior you become, or the more you move up in terms of your responsibilities, the more communication is essential. It's a little bit of a paradox, you know. I think that, you know, sometimes MBA students, when they're worried about, you know, their first job and so forth, that's not top of their agenda. But maybe it is, but maybe it's not. But if it's not, it should be, because within very few years, you have to be able to communicate effectively. And again, if you're moving into senior leadership roles, I don't want to say it's all there is, but it's a big part. You know, my sense is that the biggest skills you have to be able, when you deal with large organization, comes back to what I said before, is you got to manage your people. That means the executive team and the culture, and you got to be able to communicate effectively, because your reputation and your brand and how you're being perceived by others is so essential. Those are two, I think, absolutely essential senior leadership qualities. So now, what are some tools that are going to be helpful here? I think the most important thing, number one, is always to ask yourself, what's in the head of your audience? And you learn this already in sales. You know, you want to know, what is it that when you're dealing with, you know, if you're like in a B2B situation, you know, what is that, or you're dealing with an investor, to be very clear and to understand as much as you can is what is in the head of your audience. Now, as Kelly said earlier, a challenge can be that there are multiple audiences, and now you have to find a way to connect with all of them. That's super important. And what is very easy for us is to either get stuck in the fact that we disagree with the audience. So it's a question about we're dismissing their issues or their concerns. Or, as I said before, we go back to our comfort zone and we're not connecting with people where they are. And so we're like basically staying for what's easy for us rather than what's effective, you know, with our audience. So this is like super important, because you have to, for example, you know, when you deal with faculty, when you talk to faculty, is my sense is what, you know, one thing that faculty are faculty for a reason. They could have chosen some other careers. You know, often these careers would have been more lucrative. But the reason they became finance faculty or marketing or accounting faculty is because they're absolutely passionate about what they're doing. And that means is that what they're doing right now is the most important thing in the world to them. And they believe it should be the most important thing to you as well. So that's the attitude. You know, if I'm like, you know, I'm doing like, you know, Egyptian archaeology right now, that's what I'm doing. And I spend my entire life on that. And I'm trying to understand that particular dig out there, you know, in the Western Nile Delta. How can you not see that? That's the most important thing in the world. And you want your faculty to be that way. You want your faculty to wake up in the morning and think about those questions that they're focused on day and night. You want that intensity, or they want to think about, you know, the research side and how to explain that to your students. That's what you want. That's the type of faculty you want. But when you talk to them, you have to remember that. You have to remember that that's what they, you know, that's what they care about. And one of the reasons for why I continue to write and continue to work and continue to write books and articles and papers, because I don't want to lose that. You know, because it's easy that, you know, once you're in leadership roles for a long time, you forget inside in your bones, so to speak, you know, what it means to work hard for hours on a particular problem and make slow progress and have wrong sides and, you know, and all these things, and you're working something, and then, you know, try somebody to ask you, so what are you working on? I'm working on this particular, you know, I'm working on like a theory of opinion formation, you know, in this particular context, I'm working on risk perception. People say, what Why would you do that? Well, because that's what you're passionate about. And so, so understanding and maintaining that perspective, I think, is super important, for a dean or for provost or for chancellor. And I personally, that's one of the reasons why I love this debate, and I, love talking to faculty about it, because it reminds me in a direct way for why we did this, why we chose this job in the first place. And it's curiosity driven, it's passion driven, it's what we did because we were driven to it, for whatever reason. So I think that's an example of that.
Well, it's we're getting up on the end of time here, so I think we have one more short question. It's probably not a short question, but you'll only have a short time to answer.
Short answer. Long question, short answer.
Yeah, Ray Friedman, one of our senior faculty in organizations, notes that there's maybe some interesting connections between reputation and status, where status is kind of more relative to others. It doesn't have that kind of concrete feeling of a certain level of reputation. And he's wondering, what that means for reputation. Is it something that we just want to have a little better reputation than another institution next to us?
It's a great question. They're not the same concept, but certainly they're related. And so I think, one way to think about it is that nobody wants to have a bad reputation. Everybody wants a good reputation. And if you can have a better reputation, well, that's even better. I think that the sense of comparisons are super important to people. I think that's just human nature. And, if you've ever spent time in an industry where there are 2 to 3 big players that absolutely hate each other, and you see the intensity of that, the kind of Coke versus Pepsi kind of rivalry is like something to behold, or Airbus Boeing or something like that. And, so the level of competitiveness, I think, can be very strong and can be very motivating. I think that's true for academia. I mean, we are very status conscious. I think we are, rankings matter to us, even though we dismiss them to some extent, but we all know what the great places are. And we all know who the leaders in the discipline are. And, we have a good understanding on that. So I think status is super important in the academy. With sometimes probably a little bit too much, or sometimes we want to make sure that it doesn't take over our decision making, but it's a factor for sure. And so as you're thinking about, reputation, particularly for academic institution, there's a strong connection with that. I think the key piece, however, is that deep down, your reputation needs to match who you are, your identity. And and I think our job as leaders and our faculty as well is to try to understand what is unique about the institution that we're part of. What's unique about Vanderbilt? What's unique about Owen? And then realize that potential. What to me is always depressing, and I've seen that at work, is when institutions that I think have a unique role in the world, and then they look over their shoulder and they say oh my God, they're doing this over there, now we have to copy them. That's awful. And I'd much rather do that. I'd much rather realize our potential than constantly worry about, who can I imitate now? I think that's how you lose your soul as a researcher, as a faculty member, and also as an institution.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much for engaging with us. I know some of our faculty might not know Daniel was down this week, sat in on one of Rita Gunn's classes, and it really was related to things we're talking about today.
Yes.
In a discussion of Citibank's mistaken $900 million payment to Revlon's creditors last month and what that meant. And of course, Rita was focused on the financial controls around that, but Daniel jumped in with our students and had a discussion around that. And we're just delighted to have you on the faculty, and really delighted that you're willing to come and engage with us on topics we all love to think about and have dedicated our careers to. So thank you.
Thank you. And I know, well, I should say at the end, I'm so grateful for all the hard work that the Owen faculty to put in over the last months to make this possible. I know that this was difficult and challenging for everyone. It was demanding on everyone. And I'm so happy and proud how we as a community stepped up. I like where we are. We're not, we're not done with that, but couldn't be happier to see everybody really pulling together in order to advance our mission, as a university. So delighted to be part of the Owen faculty and, have a great semester. And I guess now, first of all, a great Labor Day weekend. So thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.